Hi, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Moatti's talk. My name is Gaohen Zhang, and I'm an assistant professor of Italian studies at UBC. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Moatti, as well as the Mobilities Group and the Center for Migration Studies. But to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the masculine people. The Mobilities Group, which is co-sponsoring the talk, aims to produce a new line of inquiry within mobility analysis at UBC. This is a new line of inquiry that's centered more on humanistic, interpretive, multilingual, culturally sensitive scholarship on multiple and intersecting mobilities. And in the past, we have brought speakers working on migration and mobility issues from multiple disciplines, such as from sociology, geography, history, cinema studies, and literature. The Mobilities Group is one group that's hosted at the UBC Centre for Migration Studies. The center was formed last term, I believe, and it seeks to bring together researchers from a wide range of disciplines. And we hope and seek to understand and engage in debate about the causes, consequences, and experiences of global human mobility. Please follow UBC Migration on Twitter, and our Twitter handle is up on the slide. Now I'd like to acknowledge our co-sponsor, which is the UBC Department of Classical Near Eastern and Religious Studies. And I also like to thank the team that helped with the logistics of putting together the series of remote talks about mobilities this year, especially Emily Amberge, Atia Yetka, Douglas Ober, and Dustin Gray. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Claudia Moatti is a professor at the Paris 8 University and at the University of Southern California. She has studied the intellectual transformations of the Roman society at the end of the Republic, the Roman notion of res publica, and the control of human mobility in the Roman Empire. This last research developed within a broader international program that she has been heading, which is titled, and I'm going to practice my really bad French, La mobilité des personnes en Méditerranée de l'Antiquité et l'époque moderne, which culminated in 3 edited volumes. Her current book projects concern migration, mobility, and the law in the Roman world, and the experience of mobility in the ancient world. So we're very, very pleased to have Dr. Moatti to deliver this virtual talk for us, which is titled On the Road, Mobility and Social Differentiation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. And as you know, I am in France. It's night and I am alone in the countryside in Touraine, immobile to speak about mobility. This is beautiful and poetic, I think. So thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be virtually among you and to talk with you about this topic of migration and mobility. Let's start with the paradox. For Christians, as for Stoics alike, human beings were all foreigners on earth. Don't you see that everything around you is hotel furniture, wrote the philosopher Seneca? You are just passing through. On a transcendental level, as Dick Herder put it, on a transcendental level, all human beings seem to hit the road in a similar manner. It was not the same on the real roads for the alive as, so to speak, for the dead, because in ancient times, tombs exhibited social inequality. In fact, Seneca added that even souls do not take the same road to heaven. This is the issue I want to address here, social differentiation on the road. People on the move and roads will thus be the main character of this paper, which will today deal mainly with ancient sources, with some insights in other periods. This paper is a part of the new research program I'm heading, the experience of mobility across time between precarity and trust. Why to focus on these two notions? Because as far back in time, and in spite of differences between places and times, mobility has been associated with the idea of precariousness in the free form distinguished by Zygmunt Bauman: insecurity, uncertainty, and safety. Novels, theater plays, epics have staged all kinds of dramatic events, changes in status or identity, attacks on physical integrity, the unpredictability of the road in distant and unknown countries, or in a close and a very familiar space, such as the Spain of Quixote, for example, has constituted the very material of the plots, reflecting, and this is important, the conception of the world divided in two, where only the original group, family, neighborhood, the city itself, offers the indispensable security. This is the starting point of the program, intentionally transdisciplinary and multi-period in scope, which includes 3 dimensions. The practical one, for example, organizational aspects of migration, a cognitive dimension, for example, the impact of mobility on affects and thoughts, and finally, a reflexive dimension, looking, for example, at the representation of mobility in different societies. The first challenge is to study the movement itself. And this is all the more difficult for historians of past societies. The second challenge is to take into account the diversity of individual experiences, while the notion of migrant that we use today seems to blur the differences. As Tim Creswell wrote, those who travel are not the people. They are pedestrians or drivers, refugees or citizens, women and men, etc. It's why in this paper, as it is the case in all the program, I will use the term mobility in a broad sense. Undoubtedly, one of the most important contributions of migration studies in the last 20 years has been the extension of the notion of mobility, migration, diaspora, and their definition as social processes. On one part, the extension of these notions have allowed historians to study a broader spectrum of human mobility. And we can say today that the idea of mostly sedentary populations, closed and stable until the Industrial Revolution, is no longer valid. On the other part, the definition of mobility as a social process has allowed historians to stress the importance of mobility for the structuration of social life. And I will add, to discover the importance of the process of socialization on the move. Finally, the idea of process allows us to consider migration not as an event which divides into the life of individuals, but as a long-term course which can last more or less time and involve deep changes. Hence, the necessary focus on what I call the in-between situations. And I define between first as the space-time of movement, with itineraries, waiting spaces, multiple intermediary statuses, and as a relational space. I will return to this idea later. So here are my questions. What kind of persons do we find on the roads in ancient societies and medieval times? And how did the encounter between the different social categories take place? According to what criteria were the routes chosen or even imposed, rank, class, gender, or function? What objects and crews accompanied the journeys? What knowledge of the route was accessible and to whom? What representations were attached to the roads? And how can the historians grasp these differences? These questions also allow us to address the issue of spatial justice, for space is qualified not by its nature, but by the people who move through it, and its access can be the object of privileges, conflicts, and tensions, and even abuses of power. So I will look at 5 moments. And first, the spectacle of the road. As I said, historians have long considered that pre-modern societies were stable and sedentary, and that only the elite could move from one place to another. In his book, The Origins of the European Economy, the Byzantinist Michael McCormick collected hundreds of examples of travelers between 600 and 900 CE. But the majority of the cases concerned ambassadors, military chiefs, pilgrims of high status, and soldiers. Since this moment, this publication in 2001, a number of works have allowed to revise these conclusions. And we know that today we could assert that all social categories were on the road, all ages, all genders, in varying proportions, of course, according to periods and regions. For ancient societies, the problem is that depending on sources, the results are not the same. And this is a first differentiation to take into account. For example, in epigraphical studies, mobility seems to have represented 5% of the persons whose names are known, among whom women represented only 18%, and poor, no one. The isotopic analysis of skeletons in necropolis, on the contrary, gives sometimes 30% of migrants, for example, in the necropolis near Rome at Ostia. As for literature, it gives a much more diverse picture, but it concerns mainly individual stories. Some sources present, however, an interesting detail, like this, an inscription found in Coptos in Egypt. Coptos was a port on the Nile, which was linked to 2 ports on the Red Sea, Myos Hormos and Berenike. And in this place, we have found an inscription, a very interesting inscription, which is called the Tariff of Coptos, which dates from the end of the 1st century, and which shows that people who came from the Red Sea to Coptos had to pay two taxes. One, the apostolion, tax to be paid by people who departed from an Egyptian port, and the amount varied according to profession, marines, workers on boats, guards, and gender. Prostitutes paid 108 drachmas, soldiers' wives and female travelers 20 drachmas. They had to pay another tax, which is in fact a toll, the pitakion, the ticket to be paid by those who took the desert track from Myosormos to Coptos. And the price varied according to their gender, men 1 drachma and women 4 drachma, and to their mode of transportation. These dispositions, these regulations are confirmed by many other documents which show that the price to the apostolion, the price to leave Egypt, changed according to the status. So if you were free, slave, citizen, Roman citizen, Alexandrian citizen, or Egyptian. These documents, as many other Egyptian sources, attest to the differentiate circulation of ordinary men and women who did not benefit from any exemption. More generally, legal and papyrological sources offer a great evidence on these people of modest condition who moved by boat, by donkey or mule, camels, on foot even, for many reasons, religious, military, judicial, economical. The Roman Empire was really a world in movement, an empire in movement, and mobility gave birth to a great variety of rules. An empire of movement, as is attested by the network of roads that you can see on this map, and the importance of rules concerning mobility. And we could come back to this point in the discussion that I will not develop in this paper. Even long distance travels were not reserved to the elite or to merchants. Artists, liberal professions, artisans, workers could travel very far away. Bilingual inscriptions, for example, show the presence of a community of people from Palmyra in the Near East, in Rome, or of Syrians in Brittany. The association of the winning artists placed under the patronage of Dionysos and under the patronage of the emperor provided to its member a diploma to benefit from the hospitality of local stations posted all around the Mediterranean. And slaves could also, in their life, travel long distances. Not only could they be employed for economic reasons, activities far away from the masters. We know, for example, that slaves could be in Syria, in Egypt, while the masters were in Rome. But of course, the road could be very long from the moment of the enslavement to the manumission or to the death of these slaves. Let's look at this beautiful inscription of Gaius Julius Mygdonius, who was born in Parthia, born free, was captured during his youth and sent as a slave to Rome. From Parthia to Rome is a long road, and then he became free and a Roman citizen thanks to his good fortune. I saved until I was 50 years old. Since then, I have been traveling towards old age, and the metaphor of travel, which is a metaphor of the life and of his destiny, is really interesting. What is more difficult to study is how people made up their mind, with what geographical imaginary, with what spatial representation. Let's remind that maps, as we know them, did not exist in ancient times. Only itineraries with lists of stops, and we don't know who really had access to these itineraries. There is something to investigate here following the specialist of the 18th century, whose name is Daniel Roche. In his book, Humeur Vagabonde, which means wandering moods, he makes an interesting distinction between mobility itself, the practice of the road, and the geographical horizon of people. He says, for example, that the horizon varied according to the social status. Literate people had as horizon in Europe, in France, for example, or in Brittany, they had Europe as horizon. The wealthiest had their country as horizon, and peasants had the neighboring villages. But at the same time, all categories were found on the road. And I have quoted a passage where he makes a list of all the people who were on the road: peasants, merchants, workers, boatmen and actors, students, pilgrims, notables, but also soldiers, physicians, lawyers, vagrants, or prisoners. And we could say that the same for the ancient times. The other question is, on what kinds of roads was it the case? Was it the case on all the roads? Were some roads reserved to specific categories? It's the second point, the problem of the choice of itinerary. It seems in fact that it is in the choice of the road that social distinction can be measured, and with it, the relationship to distance. In the Roman Empire, for example, officials and soldiers followed mandatory itineraries, which were quicker on sea as on earth. Distance was not the same on an official boat or on a supply boat, for example. They were more controlled too, and more comfortable also, since on these roads, officials were taken care of all along their trip, being able to use the imperial post to be accommodated and to make requisitions of food and means of transportation. To move away from these official itineraries was considered as illegal and suspicious. It's the case, for example, in this speech of Cicero in the 1st century BCE, a speech against Vatinius, who was a legate of the Senate. He was sent to Spain, and Cicero attacks him because he used an itinerary which was not at all official. Although the trip is usually made by land, and if one prefers a trip by boat, one must follow a certain route, certa ratio navigandi. Didn't you visit first Sardinia and then Africa? Didn't you stop in the kingdom of Yemsal when it was forbidden to do so without a Senate decree? Then to the kingdom of Mastanesosis? Which legate has even reached Spain by such an itinerary? So the threat, of course, of somebody who used a different itinerary was that he was trying to create personal contacts with kingdoms, and then perhaps to be a threat to Rome. To move away was also a source of disorder and violence, since when officials and soldiers went off the road, it was mainly for unofficial requisitions. We have a lot of inscriptions concerning the abuse made by soldiers and officials when they left the main roads. For example, an Hadrian's edict of the 2nd century CE, prohibiting the soldiers to leave the main roads. A governor of Asia in 183 reminding soldiers on march not to stray off from the main roads. And a very famous inscription from Thrace, north of Greece, which provides peasants' complaint against soldiers who leave their proper routes and appear among us and abuse them, of course. There was thus in the Roman Empire as in medieval times, a hierarchy of maritime and terrestrial roads, the main roads being specifically conceived for the officials. However, it will be an error to believe that main roads and stations of the imperial post even could not serve to civilians, in opposition to what happened in ancient China, where only the emperor could take the imperial road. In fact, for common people, the choice of itineraries depended rather on the length of the travel and above all on its costs, since tolls heavily weighed on the use of the main roads. Travelers could thus choose substitution pathways and meet a great variety of social categories, as the medievalist Marc Bloch suggests here. In the Middle Ages, I can see tracks with all sorts of junctions that the traveler could choose from almost indifferently, so that many places far apart from each other could be on the same road at the same time. In some places, the possible route becomes narrower and more fixed. It's a ford, a bridge, a dike, or a march. Or it is a prince who, in the interest of his toll or safe conduct rights, compels merchants to conform to a precise itinerary. Here again, however, what was compulsory and consequently stable. So what he mainly says is that there is a great fluidity of the different roads. But what I think is interesting for us who work on mobility is the difference he makes between tracks, roads, route, junctions, this distinction of different level of organization, and the idea that there was also a multiplicity of logics and not just a social logic. Travelers could also choose to travel by sea, not by road, by sea, by rivers, because it seems that it costed less in ancient times as in the medieval period, but the presence of the roads along the roads, like here in for the Danubian, along the river, so the roads along the river, the Danubian, gives a more complex image of the terrestrial circulation. So it was the case in the Danubium, it was the case also in medieval times along the Rhone and the Saône in Gaul. And perhaps was it here again less expensive to follow the road when tolls were weighted on rivers, although it was much more risky. Let's jump to the third section. The historian has other manners to measure social differentiation. He can look at how travelers feed themselves on the road, what goods they carry for their own use, and at their own, and it can look at their own means of locomotion. I will make 3 remarks here. First, let's remind that walking has been the most important mode or mean of transportation until the 18th century, including for people of higher rank. But first, it was not the only one. And second, so to speak, not all people did walked in the same way. Walkers, like the poet Horace or the writer Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, were wandering in the countryside. Pilgrims who saw in the road the moment of penitence and sometimes walked barefoot. Philosophers in search of the truth did not walk with the same pace, and did not inhabit the road in the same way as people of higher rank in a hurry to arrive at destination. Following mingled, we could say that the former fully occupied the space of the road. The former, I mean the poets, pilgrims, philosophers, fully occupied the space of the road, progressing with the time, while the latter, the people of importance, were racing against time, jumping from one stage to another. It's interesting to note that in the Roman sources also, as it is attested in Plautus, for example, slaves were always in a hurry, it's the contrary, and free men strolled. It is normal that free men moved in the city at a measured pace, modico gradu, but I think that it is the fact of a slave to run in hurry. But a gentleman's walk, as says O'Sullivan, required thought. To move too slowly was to run the risk of being thought effeminate. The second remark is about objects. Inequality can be studied through objects carried by travelers. Sources are most of the time elusive, but some texts give details, as in this interesting inscription, which is which contains customs regulation from Asia Minor, dating from the 1st century CE. Nobody shall pay tax on anything he carries for his own personal use, it's the general formula, or for the provisions which are carried for the journey in good faith. And then there is a list. No one shall pay tax for slaves and domestic animals brought from home or carried for personal use during the journey. You see the juxtaposition between slaves and domestic animals. And we don't know what domestic animals, dogs or horses, mules, etc. Nor for rolls, tablets, letters, and documents, nor for shoes and seals which people use when they are abroad, nor for provisions. It's interesting to see that the allusion to rolls, tablets, letters, and documents, which could be either documents of identification, and we could come back to that, letters of recommendations, or codices, which contain the expenses during the trip. And we can see also shoes and seals which people use when they are abroad, and you will see in a minute how it's important to refer to this part of the objects. Precisely, we have another document which is very interesting. It's an exceptional papyrological document from the 4th century, and it concerns the travel of a man, Theophanes, a Roman official who lived in Egypt and was a practicing lawyer. He was a very wealthy and important citizen of Hermopolis. Around the year 320, he was charged to make a case in Antioch of Syria. And so it's a long road from the middle of Egypt to Antioch. And he kept the record of the cost of his journey by boat and by road, which back and forth lasted 6 months. So we have 1,500 lines of Greek text, which offer exceptional information. For example, a long list of items carried for the trip: clothes, blankets, towels, pillows, toiletries, utensils packed, which shows that he will sometimes camp along the road. The list also alludes, which is also interesting, I will come back to that, to gifts of all kinds, money for those he could meet, and for soldiers who escorted him in some parts of the trip, but also jewelry and a lot of shoes and various formal wear needed in case he would be accommodated in important houses. So it's a kind of miniature household, as John Matthew puts it. It's interesting since other sources show that upper classes in Rome, senators and knights, used their insignia, so specific toga, sandals, rings, coats, to prove their identity and to be authorized, for example, to use the imperial post when they did not have a safe conduct. The display of social differentiation had increased over time, but it did not concern only officials. As inside the city, the road quickly became the occasion for the richest to distinguish themselves. Let's take this letter of Seneca, letter to Lucilius. Seneca boasted of traveling modestly with a limited number of slaves and without any other effect than those we have on us. On my mattress on the ground, 2 coats act as a sheet, 1 as a blanket. So it's a very modest crew and modest equipage. But he confessed that he was ashamed of his car, pulled by skinny mules and a barefoot muleteer, and each time a rather elegant crew came to meet him, he blushed. The blush of shame and of social differentiation. We have here a wonderful text about social differentiation on the road. In fact, while even the rich were forced to reduce their luggage and if they were obliged to hurry, dismiss their servants, some competed in luxury, set off, and I quote again Seneca, set off with their golden crockery, moving on horses as swift as the winds, all covered in purple and embroidered brushes, golden necklaces hanging and floating on their chests, slapping brakes of fawn gold. In the following century, a famous rhetor, Polemon, had the same reputation of extravagancy. His contemporaries blamed him for the train on which he was followed on his travels. So many beasts of burden, so many horses, so many servants, so many different kinds of dogs for the different kinds of hunting, while he himself advanced mounted on a chariot from Gaul or Phrygia with silver brakes for the horses. For others, conversely, the chariot that Polemon used to take, the chariot was the worst, and they prefer, and because the chariot was the worst, because if you look at the road, you can see how chariots could reverse very frequently. And some prefer the perils of the saddle to a seat in a carriage on account of the trouble caused by their baggage, the weight of the vehicle, the delays to progress, the roughness of the track. It's a quotation from Apuleius, an author of the 2nd century. In fact, the horse was also a sign of distinction, even if the aristocrat gained less in speed and comfort than in prestige and height. It's also what shows a mosaic from the 4th century from Carthage, which is a mosaic which represents the domain of Master Julius, Dominus Julius. And we see here on the left of the mosaic, the master arriving on horse and followed by the servant. I put the detail on the right. He's followed by the servant who is on foot and who carry the luggage of the master. That said, until the 18th century, the road was hard for everybody, even for riders, and especially outside the main axis. At the end of the period, the emergence of the stagecoach and mail coach constituted a qualitative change, but the cost remained very high. This new means of communication created literally a two-speeds world, so that spatial injustice, defined as unequal access to infrastructures, increased. The train introduced a semblance of equality and softened the penability of the road. For example, for Thomas Cook, railways traveling is traveling for millions. The humble may travel, the rich may travel. It promotes universal brotherhood. In fact, new inequalities appears. Not only the gap widened between the main axes and the regional ones, but the social differences were more and more displayed. Rich and poor did not travel in the same wagon. In Great Britain, as John Urey has recalled, trains had three classes. But before climbing in the train, in the station itself, we could see the difference between those who had a servant for carrying their luggage and the others. In the United States, where the trains were without distinction of classes, social differentiation was visible, for example, in the waiting room. What did this mean of transportation change? What these means of transportation also changed was visible, was the modalities also of interactions between people. And I will go on the fourth point, but perhaps we could make a break for 5 minutes and see if people have questions in order to better progress in the topic. So if you feel comfortable to have a break, I'm available for responding to questions.
Yes. Let's take a quick 5-minute break. And if you have any questions, if you'd like to simply raise your hand and ask by via audio or video, please raise your hand and I can ask. Yes. I see. Please unmute and go ahead.
Great. Thank you for
Matthew. Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for this. And it's wonderful to see the sort of micro dynamics of status and experience play out on these roads. I suppose my question for you is whether there's a shift in social differentiation and experience between urban roads when you're in the city and those outside. Is it just a matter of sort of nesting dolls relationship where the city is reproducing the same dynamics as these out of town roads, or are they different in nature?
It's a very good question, and I think you gave the response. I think it's the expansion of the city on the road, and especially in status societies, where status is so important, even if status is not the only way and the only logic of interactions. And if you look at slaves in the economic life, there is a great difference between status and practice. But yes, I think the extension of, and we will see in the next part as but it's important to see the extent. The road is the extension of the diversity, but with restrictions. I nearly respond to your question in the next paragraph.
Thank you.
But it's a very good question. Very good, very well framed. If there are no questions, I can go ahead because it's already late now.
Sure. Yeah, let's go ahead.
So I go ahead. No other questions? Okay. So in this part, I have described the road as a time-space space-time moment, and but it's a space. But it's also a relational space. And in fact, the road has been always described as a space for encounters. And this is the second meaning of in-between experience, where in-between refers to the experience of interaction. From the Satyricon of Petronius to the Quixote of Cervantes or Moll Flanders of Defoe, novels have dealt with this topic, taking the road as a privileged backdrop because it embodies the place by excellence where people, usually separated by social hierarchy or by space, could meet, but also where intrigues, plots, and treasons of all sorts could happen. This interaction could in fact be dangerously asymmetrical. In his book, Migration in World History, Peter Manning distinguishes several categories of smugglers and middlemen who deal with migrants. Recruiters who convince or force people to leave, dispatchers who direct them on the road, guides, guards to protect or oppress, food or shelter providers, contacts on arrival. This reminds me of pre-modern robbers of children and of poor people, or these captains of ships who in the early modern period abused indentured migrants. But this violence did not and does not concern only, and does not concern today, only poor people. Asymmetry came and comes today in great part from inequality in knowledge and in organization. Ancient sources show how people of lower classes, such as customers, innkeepers, interpreters, guides, could acquire a position of authority and abuse those who were on the move, including members of the elite. The geographer Strabo, for example, narrates the expedition of Aelius Gallus, prefect of Egypt under Augustus, in Arabia Felix, and how he was deceived by his guide, so he was deceived by Silaus, the king's minister. This one was a person of importance, but who had promised to be his guide on the march and to assist him in the execution of his design. Silaus was, however, treacherous throughout, for he neither guided them by a safe course by sea along the coast, nor by a safe road for the army, as he promised, but exposed both the fleet and the army to danger by directing them where there was no road, or the road was impracticable, where they were obliged to make long circuits or to pass through tracts of country destitute of everything. Ancient literature abounds in cases of that kind, and the insistence shows that the risks were real. They are also documented by papyrological evidence, which have conserved contracts that travelers concluded with their guides before they left, asking them to serve also as bodyguard. In one of them, the bodyguard takes an oath promising to look after his clients day and night and not to leave them until they have reached their destination. Trust as a response to precariousness had a price. These contracts were costful, but also could increase precarity since they were not always efficacious. The cost of knowledge or ignorance and of protection is another clue of social differentiations, since not all individuals could afford for that. It played a fundamental role in the history of mobility and migration, Let's think also of the ransoms of captives, of the gifts to officials and soldiers, as we have seen in the Theophanes travel, until the insurances of modern times. What I wanted to stress in this and to respond to the question of Matthew before is that, as you see, asymmetrical relationship is not just for poor people versus rich people, but also the road is the place for social inversion, we could say, when people of modest rank has a kind of authority on people of higher rank. So these social differentiations works at the same time as in the city and could be the reverse of the city. There is a second form of inequality on the road, which sources document. Let's start with a quotation from Timothy Brooks' wonderful book, Great State, China and the World. Timothy Brook alludes to a Chinese handbook written in the 15th century for Korean travelers. And this handbook gave this advice. When you meet someone on the road, don't get into an argument about who is right and who is wrong. Be a good friend and don't embarrass them. Travel together as brothers born to the same parents. When you are on the road, support each other. So there is it's a wonderful advice, which reminds us the reflection of Cook. And everybody, there is a brotherhood between travelers. But in fact, if you read the text again, you can see that behind the advice, we guess the possibility of danger and conflict between people of different social rank. I would like to show you this, how the ancient sources were conscious of this problem. And I have gathered 3 texts which offer a surprisingly convergent point of view on this issue. I start with Euripides' Phoenicae, where as you know, the Jocasta, the mother of Oedipus, narrates the unpredictable encounter between Oedipus and the king of Thebes, Laios, whom he did not know was his father, and the conflict which caused the death of Laios. So when my son had become a man with tawny beard, either because he had guessed or learned it from another, he set out for the shrine of Phoebus, wanting to know for certain who his parents were. And so did Laius, my husband, seeking to learn if the child he had exposed was dead. And the two of them met at the branching road of Phocis. And Laius' charioteers ordered him, "Stranger, make way for the king." But he walked on without a word in his pride. The horses with their hoofs drew blood from their tendons of his feet. Then, why need I speak of matters outside these evils? Son slew father, and taking his chariot, gave it to Polybus, his foster father. So a scene with a great violence. And we see here all the elements that we can see, all the elements which represent the road, the hazards of the road, different social conditions, and power relations on the road, which echo, of course, power relations in the city. The second text is a passage, it was here, this map, to show you where it happens, and it's nearly here. The second text is a text from Seneca, a letter to Lucilius, which evokes the same behavior of riches on the road. We now travel only preceded by a squadron of Numidian horsemen and a legion of riders. It's pity to have no one who throws out of a road those who will pass you and who announces by streams of dust that here comes a man of importance. It's pity to have no one who throws out of the road. We have the same scene of violence and power relation, which reproduces the differences of status. The third text comes from Apuleius in the 2nd century, where Apuleius mocks at the attitude of the same wealthy people which changes when they meet a wealthier and more important person. In spite of their excessive impatience, they throws out of the road those who pass them. So in spite of their excessive impatience, out of deference to him, they stop their run, slow their pace, delay their beast, and in the blink of an eye, they jumped to the ground. The branch they hold to strike their horse, they pass it in their left hand. It's a very precise detail. And their right being free in this way, they approach this figure, greet him. If he asks them a few questions that prolong the interview, they walk and chat with him. Finally, whatever the delay, they willingly resign themselves to this duty. So 3 texts, which between the 5th century and BCE and the 2nd century CE, describe the more or less violent ritual of the encounter between social classes, between unequal social classes, as if the road was too straight for 2 groups, the most humble having to cede the place or to adapt themselves to the rhythm imposed by the powerful, exactly as it would be the same in an inn or in the lodge. Historical evidence reveal the same kinds of violence on the road with other logics. Economic one, for example, when vagrants were forced to work in late antiquity, or racial ones, when in the 19th century in Virginia, freedmen risked to be re-enslaved for the only reason that they were on the road. The access to the road was a sign of liberty. Freedom of movement was reserved to citizens, and this was denied to Black people, even if they had been manumitted. Social spatial injustice can take different forms, different logics concerning rank, gender, race, whether it concerns the unequal access to the road or even the prohibition of its access. This explains why the road acquires also different values, different meaning according to the context. And I will conclude on this important question. The road could be both the metaphor of human existence or the metaphor of social condition. Let's start with the first metaphor. The road as a metaphor of human existence. It's a very common, it's a topos of a literary topos, but there are differences in the way it is defined. We could distinguish 3 traditions. 2 of them are literary. And I use here the distinction of the 2 literary traditions proposed by Mikhail Bakhtin. He distinguished adventures novel and from the 5th century, like the Ethiopica or the Adventures of Leucippe and Callirhoe, where these the novels which present the road as a hiatus between 2 moments of the life, but the experience does not change the characters. The in-between situation is without consequences. The characters are the same before and after these incredible adventures which happened. The second category of novels are those who are in continuity with Apuleius' Metamorphoses, for example, or Petronius, where the road transforms the character. But the only successful travel is the virtuous travel. And in fact, the main character of Apuleius, Lucius, is transformed all along in many ways, all along the story, until he becomes a disciple of Isis, the goddess Isis. There is a third tradition which can be found in Christian sources of late antiquity, where wandering on the road was a metaphor of sin. And it's interesting to quote this tradition, because I think there is a matrix of this metaphor in legal sources of Roman law. And you see that for the Romans in legal sources and in the jurisprudence, wandering on the road without purpose, without moral purpose, was the fact of a very bad citizen, a very bad paterfamilias. We have here the idea that the road could be also a danger for morality. So there are different manners to inhabit the road and to consider, to represent the road. Different manners within a period, and of course between periods. There is such a difference between the wandering of a knight and the wandering of the literate people of the Renaissance. But so I cannot insist, I see the time is passing, but the road could also be seen as a metaphor of a social condition. And I will finish with this wonderful study of Jean Harouille, who is a semiologist, a French semiologist, who has written an article in French, but it is called The Imaginary of the American Road. And he introduces interesting distinction on these social uses of the road in the United States. It shows, for example, that in the 19th century, pioneers traced the road where it did not yet exist, and photographs capture the promising furrow that their wagons had just made in the virgin land. After the Great Depression in the 19th century, the departure of impoverished farmers on foot or by wagon symbolized the despair of an entire people. And the road, the photograph captures the road as the place for despair. Finally, in the 50s, the poets of the beat generation took to the road with enthusiasm in search of their American identity. In Jack Kerouac's novel, On the Road, whose manuscripts of 40 meters, like a huge papyrus, or evokes the road itself. But in this book, it's first marginal people whom the reader discovers, but also the huge size of the American space, and then the fascination for the pure movement, the irrepressible need for this young generation to set off without direction, to find its rhythm, to allow itself to be taken in by fatigue, the litany of the road and the asphalt, and finally to find itself again. Behind all these experiences, the road reveals itself first and foremost as what we could call a sociotope, a space where the world's diversity can be read, where the different aspirations of different social groups are also expressed. This is why it must be considered as a historical object in its own right, and even as an actor in history, with a thickness that is out of all proportion to its linear representation on itineraries or geographical maps. Analyzing the social uses of the road and the rituals of interactions allows us to better understand the complexity of in-between situations, to evaluate the degree of spatial injustice of each society, and to capture the movement itself and its effects in history. Thank you for your attention.